Hello and welcome back to Have We Got Planning News for You after our 2-week break. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope your February has been good so far. Welcome to our YouTube viewers. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all our updates at the earliest opportunity. And can I, as always, start with my usual reminder to you to consider making a charity donation in place of a registration fee, either to our preferred charities, the NHS Combined Justice and Page and Shelter, or to a charity of your choice. Now, our special guest this week is quite extraordinary, really. None other than the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who, along with the Archbishop of York, recently commissioned a report into the housing crisis. That report, called Coming Home, for reasons which you will hear from Archbishop Justin, was published this week, and we're extremely fortunate that the Archbishop has agreed to discuss it with us. Now, given his very busy schedule, we had to meet with him yesterday and pre-record the interview. So we will be playing that exclusively as a world premiere in the second half of this show, which means we're going to do things ever so slightly differently. I'm slightly relieved that I don't get to have to ask the Archbishop of Canterbury what he's drinking this evening, it must be said.
Chicken.
Bit of a cop out, that one. And so he's not on screen now. We're going to do Nudge Champion of the Week before the interview with him, and then close with that interview. Sasha, in perfect time, has come from joined us from his inquiry. Paul is still, I think, his witness is being cross-examined at the moment, but he promises he will be with us very shortly. So without further ado, let's introduce that much of the panel that we have before us, starting as ever with Mary in the gallery.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. It's lovely to be here, and this is such a special show. So yes, Mary Cook, Town Legal, in the gallery, drinking water, hoping somebody's going to turn it into wine later.
And Chris, how are you, mate?
Hello, Charlie. I'm here in Hogwarts again, and getting a little bit sick of working at home all the time, but that is how it is. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I am here and I'm not drinking anything this week because it's Lent and I've given up alcohol, and I can't tell you how difficult that is. That is really challenging, but we are meant to give up things that are challenging. And I'm here with Presumption. Presumption, as you can see, is in his bishop's mitre. He's got his dog collar on, and what he's got to the side of him, I don't know if you can see that, is the badge that went on my grandfather's robes. My grandfather was the vicar of Clint for 30 years and a rural dean and an honorary canon. So that is from the Diocese of Worcester, just to remain topical.
I'm just enjoying his early introduction to yoga. I'm afraid you've only got me for 5 minutes because my inquiry is going back at 5:15. So I just thought I'd come and say hello and say we've got the best show ever. And I'm in London. And I cannot wait to have the rest of the programme. I'll be back at about 5:30 with a fair wind. So I just wanted to say hello and test Chris's ability to improvise by he can do my case summary.
Thanks, Sasha. We'll see you. Good luck in the rest of it. Well, Charlie Banner here, Casey James. I haven't given up alcohol for Lent. I've got a Bavarian monk's beer. It's the closest I could get to a sort of religious theme. And in fact, I've even got some chocolates too, so the opposite then. Instead, for Lent, I've given up museums and zoos and non-essential shopping and pubs and bars and restaurants and holidays and fun. But hopefully that will all come back soon. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the serious stuff. And we've got 5 updates to give you this week, rather than the usual 4, because we've been away for 2 weeks. And Mary, you're going to kick us off with the latest missive from the Supreme Court about village greens.
Yes, that's right. So this is, as you say, a decision of the Supreme Court. And this litigation is about a landowner trying to overcome the registration of land as a TVG, i.e. Town Village Green. And the Supreme Court dismissed TW Logistics Limited's appeal against the decision of the Court of Appeal in 2018, who in turn had dismissed an appeal from the decision of a judge sitting in the Chancery Division, who had dismissed a claim seeking the rectification of the Commons Land Register. in order to basically overturn, if you like, the decision to register the land as a TVG in the first place. So you can see that the landowner had to really try hard and lost at every stage. So the appellant, and Rob has a plan. Maybe when I'm just describing this, Rob could put up the plan. The appellant owned the private working port at Mistley. This is the land. The plan shows the land that was the subject of the registration as a TVG, and that land included an area of some 200 square meters, as you can see, close to the water's edge. And across which port vehicles, including heavy goods vehicles, were driven. And in 2013, thank you very much, Rob, a local resident applied to East Sussex County Council as the registration authority to have the land registered. And that was in itself triggered by the erection of a fence, which itself was triggered by concerns from the Health and Safety Executive about people falling into the water. You've got to feel a little sorry here for the appellant who owned the port. But in any event, following an inquiry, the inspector was satisfied that the evidence demonstrated 20 years user as of right for recreational purposes. Those are the three key ingredients. And so he recommended that the land be registered. The appellant sought to overcome that, firstly, relying on a case called Newhaven, which was a case about a beach. And that was a case in which it was decided that the beach couldn't be registered as a TVG because it was part of a port operated by a landowner pursuant to statutory obligations which were incompatible with registration as a TVG. The second point was that the landowner's rights were said to be incompatible with such registration. That is the right to, for example, take an HGV vehicle over this land. And then the third point was that exercising their land use rights would expose them to potential criminal liability under these rather ancient Victorian statutes. So at first instance, the judge found that because this was a private port, they couldn't rely on Newhaven. Secondly, the judge found that there was nothing incompatible between the recreational rights that could be exercised by the public and the rights of the port to take traffic across this land. So that left the third point, and again, the court found that there was nothing inconsistent between the exercise of the rights and it wasn't exposing the landowner to criminal proceedings. So in the Court of Appeal, the first ground fell away. And in the Court of Appeal, they reminded the appellant of the decision in Lewis v. Redcar, which was that explained that the rights of a landowner to continue pre-existing activities continued, notwithstanding TVG registration, and the principle of give and take was established, so that there was nothing inconsistent between registration and a landowner's rights, and that they could continue. So that was the end of ground two. So by the time it got to the Supreme Court, there was only one point, and that was the central point about whether the registration of the land as the TVG would have the consequence of continuing with the landowner's pre-existing commercial activities, would effectively expose the landowner to this criminalisation. And basically, counsel for the appellant said that his client had been committing criminal offences ever since the land was registered as a TVG. Well, you can imagine that didn't go down very well in the Supreme Court. And neither was that accepted by Essex County Council as the registration authority. And it wasn't accepted by the Supreme Court. And that was really the end of it. But the moral of all of this is that it's clear that the modern concept of a town and village green is much wider than the traditional green village that we might think of, and that it now includes a private port. And previous cases have included areas of rocks used for the mooring of boats, partly submerged scrubland, and disused quarries. So don't expect TVGs just to look green. Secondly, if you're buying some land and it is registered, you need to make sure that you understand the scope of the recreational rights so that you know whether those recreational rights interfere with what it is you want to do as a landowner. So those are the two morals that I draw from that. Thank you very much. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Well, I'm going to take the next case, which is known as Pierce and the Secretary of State for Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, but it is known almost ubiquitously as the Norfolk Vanguard case. And this is a decision of Mr. Justice Holgate quashing the DCO under the Planning Act 2008 in relation to a failure to assess cumulative effects lawfully. The Norfolk Vanguard scheme is one of the largest offshore wind projects in the world, involving 158 wind turbines. And the Vanguard project is closely related to a second wind farm scheme known as Norfolk Boreas, which was the subject of a separate DC application submitted about a year later. The Vanguard examination of the DCO ran from December 2018 to June 2019. The dates are important. Excuse me, with the decision on the 1st of July 2020. The Boreas examination was about 9 to 10 months later, and a decision hasn't yet been issued, anticipated in April 2021. The two projects share the same overall parent company promoter, Vattenfall, and they were due to share a grid connection, as well as much of the onshore and offshore cable corridors. And that cable route would run onshore to a new substation, which was to be located near the village of Necton, which is where a lot of the opposition to the scheme was. Development at Necton was, so Mr. Justice Holgate described it, on any view substantial, and importantly, it would be broadly double in size if Boreas was consented to, so as to deal with the additional electricity throughput. Now, unsurprisingly, it was common ground at the DCO stage between the parties that the cumulative impacts of Vanguard and Boreas in combination needed to be assessed in the Vanguard environmental statement. And indeed, they were assessed in the environmental statement. But the PIMS examining authority report, with which the Secretary of State for Bays agreed, concluded that they didn't need to consider and wouldn't consider cumulative landscape and visual impact assessment due to, and I'm quoting the examining authority's report, due to the limited amount of details available in relation to the Boreas scheme, which, if you remember, was coming later. And they went on to say it would be most appropriate for cumulative impacts to be considered in any future examination in relation to North Boreas. So effectively, the in-combination landscape and visual effects, particularly in relation to the substation at Necton, were being left for consideration at the second consenting stage for Boreas. And that was the principal focus of the judicial review. Agreeing with the claimants, Mr. Justice Holgate held that the examining authorities and thus the Secretary of State's failure to evaluate the cumulative impacts at Necton of the two schemes was in breach of the infrastructure EIA regulations and was also irrational in public law. The reason for this is that the developer hadn't identified any difficulties in assessing cumulative effects of Boreas, and the EIA regs make clear where there are difficulties in doing the assessment, you have to say so. And they hadn't said so. Indeed, they've done a cumulative assessment. So in that context, leaving aside the assessment of cumulative landscape and visual effects to the Boreas examination stage was too late, because by that stage, Vanguard would have been consented, and the consent for Vanguard would fix Necton as the location for the substation. So when the cumulative effects came to be considered in this at the Boreas DCO, the option was only how do you mitigate the Necton substation, as opposed to should it be a Necton in the first place. The die was cast by grant of consent for the Vanguard scheme. And on that basis, the claim was allowed and the DCO was quashed. And I'd say in terms of lessons learned, that it's firstly, the case is obviously a salutary reminder of the care needed in considering cumulative effects and the dangers when those effects are in combination with an as yet unconsented project, the dangers of relying on that future consenting decision as a complete answer to the consideration of community effects. You can't just kick the can down the road if you're able to assess the impacts now, and if failing to do that would somehow prejudice the range of considerations in the second project. So that's a relatively unusual quashing from Mr. Justice Holgate. And over to you, Chris, and you're going to tell us about a planning appeal decision in Bromsgrove, which is the closest town to where I was brought up. I went to primary school in Bromsgrove, wrote the fanzine for Bromsgrove Rovers Football Club, My dad is buried in Bromsgrove Cemetery, so a place very close to my own heart. And you're going to tell us about some extra homes that have been granted there.
This is an appeal from Bromsgrove in Worcestershire, same district as the village of Clent, where my grandfather was the vicar for 30 years. An appeal for 500 houses allowed on a greenfield site on the edge of Bromsgrove. And this is a situation where the appellants, Catesby Estates, who are part of Urban and Civic, and Miller Homes, were appealing on an allocated site. So the site was allocated in the Bromsgrove local plan. I acted for the authority in that plan. And the application was submitted in November 2016. The appeal was heard in November 2020, and the inspector was Richard Clegg, who regularly features on this show. If we look at the details of the application, I don't know if Rob can bring that up on the screen. You will see that it was for residential, and amongst, this is the fifth bullet point, amongst the matters being considered was the demolition of the Greyhound Public House, and the inquiry sat for a whole week. Now, you might ask yourself, hang on a minute, an application in 2016, but an appeal in 2020. Why was that? And the reason is that there was a previous appeal. If we have a look at paragraph 11 of the decision, we can see there was a previous appeal on this site when the site was a draft allocation and the appeal was dismissed. The inspector concluded that the scheme would have a severe residual cumulative impact on traffic congestion, movement and highway safety. The plan was at that stage at the examination stage, but there was no dispute about it being an appropriate allocation. The council were fully supportive of it. The real issue was the Greyhound pub that I mentioned before. The Greyhound pub stood in the way of the site. It's on two sides of a road and did not allow the junction improvements that might otherwise have been considered appropriate. And so the appeal was dismissed with a pretty clear indication that the Greyhound pub was required. There you go. There's the site, Greenfield site on the edge of Bromsgrove. I hope the memories are flooding back for you, Charlie. So what that proves, I think, is pretty significant, which is the white paper proposals are suggesting that in growth areas, there'll be automatic planning permission. But that's not going to work, is it? In situations where there are highway or junction difficulties that need to be overcome. What that will mean is the growth areas will have to investigate all this at the local plan stage, which means the local plan will then go even slower because you'll have to look at the detail that you would look at with allocated sites at an outline stage. These stages have a reason. That's why they're there. Anyway, back to the facts of the case. The appeal was allowed. The appellants were represented by the ever fantastic Rupert Warren. And I should say they secured a full award of costs in relation to this case. The council case was considered by the inspector unreasonable. Look, there's Paul Tucker. Hello, Paul Tucker.
Hello.
Thanks, Chris. I must say before we get,
I haven't finished, Charlie. I've got another hour. But can I just ever so quickly mention if you look at the case, if you've got issues about the use of the DMRB against manual for streets, paragraphs 19 and 20, look at that issue. If you've got issues about not meeting all the standards required by the Highway Authority, look at paragraph 30. And if you've got issues about whether you need to go, you can't go over 0.85 in the RFC, the congestion reference flows, because people often say you mustn't go above 0.85. Again, the inspector deals with that. So this wasn't without its difficulties that were raised by the locals and raised by the council. There were difficulties, but the inspector dismisses those, doesn't consider that they should stop the appeal, and indeed awards costs. So for highway consultants everywhere, it's a must read, that one.
Thanks, Chris. And Paul's just noting in the comments that it's worth noting the Inspector endorsed Section 106 contribution for the local NHS trust, contrary to the approach taken in the Wilbur Barton Secretary of State decision last year, more on which next week. Chris, I'm very sorry to say there's some bad news for presumption. David has told us he's going to have to go before the Archbishop arrives, because Leviticus tells us in the Old Testament that these are the birds you are to regard as unclean. The horned owl, the screech owl, the little owl, the great owl, the white owl, and the desert owl. So, sorry, presumption, but it sounds like you are literally heretical, and
yes.
You cannot be in the, certainly can't wear that hat. And
does he look bothered?
Now, who's next? It's Paul. You're going to tell us about one of Chris's cases, actually.
I thought I was telling you about Harbour Road, Desborough.
Oh. No, I thought it was one of Chris's cases. No, that's the other one.
Don't tell me that I prepared all of this, having just literally walked out another inquiry with my due process, and I've got the wrong case. Thanks, Charlie. That's really made my day. Right, I'm going to tell you about Desborough, whether I'm scheduled to or not. Right. So this is an appeal allowed by Mr. Inspector Hannah on the 10th of February. So far as I'm aware, Chris had nothing to do with the case, because it was Giles Cannock for the appellant and Steph Hall for the local authority. And congratulations, by the way, to Steph, who had a baby on Monday. So many congratulations to her, to David, and to baby Benjamin. It's an interesting case because it really revolved around the up-to-dateness of policy in a local plan, but the consistency with previous appeal decisions. So the inspector concluded that a site which was immediately adjacent to a settlement for residential development, a relatively modest settlement in Kettering Borough, was outside the settlement boundary, but the settlement boundary was out of date, notwithstanding the existence of a 5-year land supply. And he concluded that policy 7 of the local plan, which was inconsistent with NPPF, was out of date. Now, that was inconsistent with a previous appeal that had taken place on another site, but the inspector notes specifically that the council's officer conceded that it was out of date in cross-examination. And counsel for the local authority, Stephanie Hall, made the point that she had taken instructions and was instructed specifically to argue that the council's case was inconsistent with her witness's concession in that regard. Very unusual for that to happen, and if it happens, you've got to make it clear to the decision maker that you'll bring a case on instructions. The inspector criticises pretty clearly at paragraph 18 of the decision that approach from the council in the light of that concession which was properly made. The decisive issue, I think, looking at it, was that the site, although it was in the countryside, was in fact a site identified in the preferred options of the emerging local plan, and there was comparatively limited harm in terms of landscape and its relationship to the settlement. But it's a really unusual case where the inspector rightly points out what is an evidential fundament, which is cases should be decided on the evidence, not decided on the basis of what your client wants you to decide the case upon. So strong thumbs up to Stephanie Hall for running the case properly. Obviously, thumbs up to Inspector Hannah for making that point explicit, and it certainly should be on the inspector's handbook to point out to future inspectors. And not criticising them, it's just
presumably also a vindication of the rigour of the inquiry process, because in a hearing you could just anything goes.
100%. That was exactly Giles's point when I spoke to him about it earlier on in the week, that this is an absolute classic of where testing the evidence was essential to demonstrate the logic behind a previous decision and why the inspector should make an inconsistent decision based upon it.
Yeah, here. Sash, I'm not going to even tell everybody what you're going to tell us about it, because I'll just be wrong. So,
I must say, you disconcerted me. I hope I've got the right bloody case. That's for sure. So I'm not supposed to swear on this edition, am I?
So long as I'm not in it, that's fine.
It is. It's one of you. No, I'm going to talk very, very briefly, because you know when you go to, you're about to go out to dinner and have a 5-course banquet, and someone gives you a bag of peanuts. That's a bit like I feel like before the Archbishop of Canterbury. Basically, I'm going to talk about a High Court case in Tame for 30 seconds, and it was a High Court case of the 16th of Feb, where Mrs. Justice Lang looked at a challenge by, this was Tame Town Council, the local town council didn't like the decision of the inspector, who effectively concluded on a scheme, a resi scheme on a historic employment site, that notwithstanding the fact that the scheme did not comply with the development plan, the other material considerations, which included PD rights and also a marketing exercise, effectively were other material considerations, and they outweighed effectively the conclusion on the development plan. Now, I'm going to just say 3 things in conclusion. Please, will people realise what Section 38.6 means, and you need to look at all the policies, not just the one that is breached. Secondly, that material considerations mean something, as shown in this case. And 3, can we make sure that people, there was an argument run on this, which is really quite interesting, which was basically, I do like that the decision was so irrational. I love the indication, the decision was so irrational, that a decision which doesn't add up, new tests in legal parlance, but a decision doesn't add up, which effectively, has reasoning, which robs the decision of logic. So there we go. You can imagine what Justice Lang thought about that one.
Of one particular planning case where Natalie Leven tried to defend a reasons challenge, saying the reasons were so bonkers they can't possibly be the Secretary of State's real reasons, and with her persuasiveness managed to succeed. Now we're going to do champion and nudge of the week before the interview, given that we then go to our pre-recording. So Mary, you're going to tell us who the champion of the week is.
So my champion was going to be the authors of Coming Home, which you're about to hear about any minute now. But then I discovered this afternoon that PINS issued some new guidance, and I was getting so excited because I thought, oh my goodness, this is it. We're back to normal life on inquiries and site visits and all the rest of it, and hearings, and we can be in the same room with each other. But sadly, no, that was a false hope, and it's the same as ever. So my champion is still the authors of Coming Home.
And I'm doing nudge, and I think we've nominated 2 nudges. So firstly, this was your idea, Mary, I've credit where credit's due. We need to nudge the government to sort out the continuation of virtual or remote meetings following the 6th of May, because the legislation which was set up in the first lockdown has a sunset clause, so it sort of falls away. And they do need to get on and video to be permanent, in my view. The ability to do it, whether or not it's actually done, is another question. And then secondly, I think possibly Chris Young's favourite human being other than immediate family is Jackie Weaver right now. And we have to give a shout out to her and nudge those who opposed her and indeed continue to oppose her in Handforth.
Yes, now, sorry, Charlie, you have no authority here.
I know. Just call me Brittany. Now, I better say, because in case it doesn't come back to me at the end, next week we have got Gorgeous George Clark, who wasn't able to join us through illness a little while ago, is going to join us, the architect from the TV. We're really hugely looking forward to our discussion with him next week, so please do join us for that. And now, if the tech works, you're going to see us from yesterday with the Archbishop. Enjoy.
It is with incredible pleasure that we welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to speak to you about Coming Home, the Church of England's report on tackling the housing crisis, launched this week. It was commissioned in 2019 by yourself and the Archbishop of York. The Commission is independent of the Church of England's institutions, with complete freedom to say whatever it thinks and believes is necessary. And this report is certainly that. It is an extraordinary piece of work put together by the commissioners, led by Charlie Arbuthnot, who was the former funding advisor to housing associations. It takes, frankly and honestly, the housing issue, the housing crisis by the horns, and addresses the poverty in our society and major issues, difficult issues like land ownership, which of course is directly relevant to the church. Now, before I turn to the questions, I have 2 quick thank yous to make. The first is to your excellent team at Lambeth Palace, who have been so helpful, and that includes Chris Cox, B. Martin, and Julianne Bretton-Noble. The second is to the man who made this all possible. Martin Kingston is someone who everybody watching will know,
but Justin may not. Martin was for much of his career one of the most preeminent planning silks in the country, a very committed Christian, and someone who in retirement is working just as hard now for the church. Without further ado, I'm going to move to the first question. And my question is simply to ask, what led you to set up the commission?
Thank you very much. And thank you to you all for inviting me to do this. One of the things about the Church of England is we've got more branches than any other institution in England. I think NatWest and people like that have about 2,500, 3,000, or Tesco, and we have 19,000 or 15,000, somewhere around there, most of which were built more than 700 years ago, fair enough, but they're there. We're in every community. And I was a vicar for 10 years, and one of the characteristics of being in a local parish, just as the local vicar, is that you see the problems. And the biggest problem that those on, certainly in the urban areas, the kind of places I've worked some of my time, and the outer estates, brought forward was the issue of availability and affordability of housing. And I was writing a book about 3 years ago. It's a very boring book called Reimagining Britain. And one of the bits of when I was writing on housing in that, one of the things that came across was that we needed to talk more about communities and less about housing. And after it had gone out, in order to try and redeem the boredom of it, someone suggested we did a commission on housing to try and pick up what our people around the country were saying. And they did. We have land. We have to think hard how to use it well. We really care about people. We deal with the fallout. We see the injustice. And at the heart of the Bible and of Christian teaching are great images of coming home. I mean, one of the best known stories of the prodigal son, you know, when he's the younger brother's gone away, he's far away, he's in a time of famine, and he says, what am I doing here? I'm going to go home to my father. The idea of home has a resonance at the depth of who we are and what we are. So all those things came together.
Can I ask, Justin, can I ask the question about how do we get, in the light of your report, how do we get the government to take the provision of housing, and particularly those who need assistance, how can we get them to take it seriously?
Well, I think the report is very clear about the nature of the crisis, which you would know, I'm sure, with your jobs better than I do. 8 million people in substandard homes, more children in substandard housing now than there were when Ken Loach produced Cathy Come Home in the mid-60s, which had a dramatic impact. 3 million houses built over the last 20, 25 years, and 2.5 million people more renting than used to. And you could go on, that it is a huge number of people who spend more than a third of their income on housing. It is going to be, it's not the government doesn't take it seriously, but I think we have a series of opportunities and crises at this moment in our country. The pandemic stripped the wallpaper and showed us the cracks in the plasterwork. We've got a generation of children at school who've had their education severely disrupted, and that's on the news in a big way today. We've got the economy having fallen more last year than any year since 1708. We've got the health service where, I mean, I go in to St. Thomas's Hospital as a volunteer assistant chaplain, And the biggest thing you see is the exhaustion level of the staff is beyond anything you can imagine. They look, at the end of a shift, they look like troops coming out of the trenches in the Great War, just absolutely ashen with tiredness and the stress of the last 12 months. And we've seen this incredible injustice in the way the pandemic, the virus has killed people. And a lot of that links to housing. Multi-generational, overcrowded, substandard housing. There are many other reasons. This crisis goes back 40 years. I'm not blaming this particular government. When we look at that, I think we have a portfolio of needs that we can bring out really powerfully to government and to landowners and to property owners and to the church and to developers and to people like yourselves, where we can have a collective view that says this has got to change. It's a solvable problem. And moreover, it's a solvable problem which is good for the economy. When you want to get an economy going, you build houses. You know, it gives you basic jobs. You've got apprenticeships, you buy carpets, you get white goods, all the stuff. So this is a win-win to get the economy going, train the people who've lost out, get us some really skilled, newly trained young workers at the beginning of their careers, and at the same time transform our society and above all our communities. Apart from that, it's all downside.
Can I just ask Justin, I'm struck by a number of points in the report, but one of which is that this is the church putting its money where its mouth is, or rather its land where its mouth is, which is really quite startling. To what extent is this deliverable with or without government assistance, or is this deliverable in terms of the church's aspirations? Do you need government buy-in for this?
That's a very, very good question, Paul. The implication of your question is that it makes change to see the church putting its land where its mouth is rather than its foot where its mouth is. I think
that was the implication.
I think you're right. It's a big challenge. The church can certainly do this and ought to do this. In one sense, the Archbishop of York, in something we did this morning, ended quite rightly with Stephen Cottrell, with something we've been saying to each other, is what this very independent and challenging report does is to say to us, where is the church's soul? You know, sorry to keep mentioning religion, but it's kind of my job, like yours is law. And there's one of the parables, or there's one of the things Jesus said is, your heart will be where your treasure is. And if your treasure's in heaven, your heart will be in heaven. If your treasure's in the bank, your heart will be with your money. And the church has a lot of land. We don't know exactly how much, we're mapping it, but the church commissioners alone have just short of 100,000 acres. We're one of the country's biggest landowners. Some of that, 6,000 acres of the church commissioners' land, is strategic land with planning potential or actual planning permission. The land we have with the dioceses, with the parishes, with the trusts and the charities is enough to be catalytic in changing this, to really catalyze a major change. But it won't lead to permanent impact unless across government there is a common vision of what housing should be, and that government comes in and everyone involved in development and building comes in. So it's got to be wide, very wide. I mean, the report starts with setting out a theological vision of good housing, but it does it in very accessible ways. And it comes up with 5 words beginning with S, which you probably see, that housing should be sustainable, environmentally friendly. It should be safe, not just from outsiders, but not like Grenfell, in other words. It should be good quality safety. It should be stable. People should know that they can put their roots down. So many people in rented accommodation move every year. I know from my own childhood how disruptive that is. It should be sociable. It should have green space and parks, but it should also be big enough that your neighbours can drop round for a cuppa. You can put your feet up and chat with other people. You build your networks. And it should be satisfying. It should be beautiful. It should be something that you get in, you sit down, you say, I'm home, with all that lovely feeling of being home is. And to do that, there's two other S's, or three, in fact, though they only picked two. There must be a strategy. So we've got to look out 20, 30 years cross-party and say, this is what beautiful housing looks like. This is what we want to have as our housing, things that meet these criteria. And it must have clear metrics for what's going to be achieved over that time so they can work backwards. And to do that will be sacrificial. So that's my 6th S. And it must be strategic. That's my 7th S. But my 8th one is an hopeful one. It is solvable. We can do this. This is not, there are some problems people have been tackling for a century and we're not, that will always be with us. This one need not be with us.
Thank you.
So I think it's exciting.
Justin, you've sort of answered a bit of my question, because my question was to ask you this really. COVID-19 and Grenfell have both served to illustrate the inequalities in housing. And I was interested in the fact that governments get elected every 5 years, and yet you have announced this 20-year political programme to improve the quality and affordability of the nation's stock. And so I was interested in why 20 years? Is that because, for example, you're trying to transcend party politics, or is it perhaps just a reflection of the size of the task?
It's both. It must be non-party political. Can anyone of you remember what the key point of the National Health Service is? What their vision is? What's the equivalent for housing? There isn't one. That's the point. Health, housing, education. Those are the three
the point of delivery.
Yeah. Every time we've had a huge shift in our society, middle of the 19th century after the cholera epidemics, after the Second World War with the Attlee government, moments where everything has been shifting, the Industrial Revolution, the end of the wartime period, or the two wars, and now with technological change and such huge change in our society, and the great crisis of COVID, and the change in our outlook around the world with leaving the European Union, three things have been engaged with by government: housing, education, health. And we don't have that vision for housing that you just all could instantly name for health. So that's the first point. We need to know where we're going. Second point, you're quite right. It's got to be cross-party. So 20 years, there will be different parties in office. And third point is that it is such a huge problem. We've got to change the expectations. If you're ever representing a developer, part of presumably what you try and do is negotiate down the level of affordable housing that is going to be compulsory. And maybe you're so much nicer than that. I must remember, if I'm ever developing, which one of you to go to. Yeah. And and one of the things that is a reasonable thing there is when someone of good ethical basis decides to develop some land they got planning permission because their great-grandfather bought a field a couple of miles from a town, which is now a big town, and suddenly someone wants to build on it. And they're going for planning permission. they have reasonable expectations, and the courts say the reasonable expectations are reasonable. So we've got to change the expectations. You can't do that overnight. It wouldn't be just, it wouldn't be fair, but you can raise the potential level of affordable or social housing steadily over a lengthy period like that. And that's a reasonable thing to do.
I completely agree. Completely agree.
Justin, do you think that there's the scope for the Church of England to partner with other significant denominations of Christianity and indeed other significant religions in the UK to maximise the effectiveness of religious leadership generally in addressing the housing crisis?
I don't just think there's scope for it. I think it's essential, which in some cases, looking at our history, has not always been what we did. I mean, we either sent them to prison or burnt them at the stake. There's an old story about a vicar seeing his bishop after the vicar had been in his post in his town parish for a year or so, and the bishop says, "So, how's it going?" He said, "It's going very well. Thank you, Bishop." And the bishop says, "Do you ever pray with your other Christian colleagues in other churches?" And he says, "Well, they pray in their ways and I pray in God's." And that's typically been the way that, historically we behaved, if one's really honest. So what's happened in the last 25, 30 years is the ecumenism, our partnership with other churches, has absolutely changed. I mean, I will routinely go and see the Pope now. Now, when Michael Ramsey went in 1966, it was top of the news. Nowadays, nobody's remotely interested. Praise God for that. I am so pleased, because that shows it's routine. So we've got the relationships. People like the Methodists have quite a lot of land. Many other churches have land. Of course, we'll partner with them. We'll partner with anyone, and certainly with other faith leaders. I mean, the chief rabbi and I get on very well. We work extremely closely with the other major faith traditions in this country, the Hindus, the Sikhs, and the Muslims in particular. If we don't partner, it won't work. What was it Benjamin Franklin said to the 13 colonies in the American Revolution? We must hang together, or we will most assuredly hang separately.
Couldn't agree more.
Moving on, my next question is about the consequences. Where would you like these recommendations to lead to? Obviously, there's a plan over 20 years, but more specifically in the short term, the report is packed full of recommendations. What do you think in terms of the implementation of those recommendations? What are your ambitions in the sort of next 5 to 10 years?
Well, there are some really quick wins. What we would love to see is one quick step from the government, which is to change the way that the benefit system works, to ensure that and to change some rules about tenancy, to ensure that people are more secure in their tenancies. It's less easy to throw them out. That landlords have a proper, not an unjust, but a proper obligation to their tenants, and the benefits for housing meet the need for housing. And those three things, you could do those in 6 months easily, government could, and it would make a really big difference. We, at the same time, have already appointed both a senior bishop, the incoming Bishop of Chelmsford, Bishop Guli Francis Decani. She is going to take over from the Bishop of Manchester, leading on housing. He will go on working on it. He's a great expert on housing. And there will be bishops around the country who lead on housing and encourage dioceses to make land available. That's two things. We've already started on that. Third thing, we're appointing someone who's been working with the Duchy of Cornwall. They've been seconded to us for 3 years, part-time, to lead an executive team that will advise on how you can do what the report says you should do, will advise dioceses and parishes and the church generally. Fourthly, we need to change our aims in certain places so that we don't always go for best value when we sell property. And we need to be willing to undertake development ourselves rather than simply selling to a developer. Now, we can do all that very quickly within 12 to 18 months, which, given we've had some of this land for over 1,000 years, is quite quick in the context of things. And I would hope in 5 years that around at least half our dioceses are actively involved in developing land, and that there is a significant amount of church commissioners' land being used for affordable housing. It doesn't mean getting no return, as you know. It just means sacrificing a bit of return and in building communities. And as a result, we've got partnerships with local government and with central government that enable significant amounts of housing to be built on an affordable and community basis. And in 10 years, that has become the habit and expectation across the development and building industry.
Justin, I was going to just ask whether if you could choose one significant change in the law that could lead to a permanent improvement, what would it be? And I was wondering whether it might be allowing the church commissioners to sell at a threshold below best consideration.
Yes, that would probably be the single most important one. I think a change in the law that applied to charities generally, to say that social purpose of the charity is a higher priority than best value, while remaining prudent and all the good things. I mean, the church commissioners are an extraordinarily effective ethical investor in equities. In equities, they're a small player by global standards. They have about, 6-7 billion. But they've leveraged that with partnerships so that they are one of the key voices in two partnerships, one of $13 trillion and one of $33 trillion. Now, whoever you go and see, $13 trillion, even Tesla or Amazon, that's a reasonable amount of money. And what they're working on with that is extremely strongly with the extractive industries and to improve their performance, mining industries, but also increasingly broadly across the equity sector on anti-slavery and all this kind of thing. They're incredibly good at it. A guy called Adam Matthews leads on it, just superb. And we just need to be able to do the same on land, just to put the social purpose right up front. And in that way, we keep our soul, and we also have a very reasonable return.
Can I just ask Justin, one of the things that we notice, obviously, in all our housing inquiries is the fundamental problem is often the local population and how they receive housing developments. I mean, without lecturing people too much, but what's your message to people about how they should perceive change, development, housing schemes? How can we change the mindset, which is quite
you can't just
common that
go in there and tell people and do things to people. You've got to do it.
That's the kind of
with them. I mean, that's how we've worked forever, since long before this was a country. And I think, therefore, anyone can understand people's anxiety about this sort of thing. I was vicar in a small rural town in mid-Warwickshire, where until, I went into the parish in 1995, until the 1980s, the population was about 3,000 or 4,000. then there was a big road running around the side of it. People started building the other side of the road. When I arrived, it was about 8,000. Now, that has an enormous effect on a community. That really, you understand why people are anxious about that. Schools. So one of the ways you've got to do it is you've got to ensure that when you're doing a development, that the social structure of the place is cared for. If you're not going to need another school, you have another school. Surgeries, shopping, all the things that you don't simply overwhelm the local society. Secondly, the long-term interest of these communities is that development that is beautiful, the 5 S's, goes ahead, because affordable development means young families. If there's a school in your town and your village, it means the school will get new kids coming in. It means new life. It means the community will keep going. Your shops will stay open. Your post office will stay open. The economy will continue to function. And we saw that when I was in that place. I mean, as we managed to draw the community in from both sides of the bypass, as they said, we saw a lot more people coming to the church, for example, and we saw growth in all kinds of ways. And the pubs were open, 9 pubs, not that I was counting, of course. And it's a really young, affordable housing means healthy communities.
Justin, my next question is really on a similar theme to Sasha's, and again born out of experience of housing schemes very often being delayed or stopped because of local politics, which in turn tends to be driven by local objections, often led by parish councils. So very often out of the best of intentions, but due to fears, etc., along the lines you've described. And I was struck by chapter 7 of the report, which, as you know, sets out recommendations for individuals to take a more selfless, indeed more Christian approach to new housing proposals, to think about what it means for those who may benefit from them. And I just wondered, recognising that it's not the church's role to sort of instruct or tell people, force people to do certain things, but is there anything more proactive that the church can do, particularly in relation to leveraging the network, this incredible network that you have, reaching the parts that others can't reach, to try and persuade, for example, those involved in the leadership of parish councils just to think about the other side of the coin?
Well, I think from my own experience and from what I see right across the diocese which I serve, which is Canterbury Diocese, obviously, local clergy are doing that very well by example and by persuasion, by personality, and also, surprisingly it may seem, quite often by sort of sermons and teaching. The Good Samaritan, that's the command to love your neighbor as yourself. These are fundamentals which resonate even with those of no faith. I mean, they go very deeply in our society. And I think that, we've had, the last year has been a year of grief and lament for unspeakable numbers of people. But there have been some extraordinary golden strands that have wound through the darkness. And one of them is the way communities have come together and realized what it means to care for your neighbor. I talked to my mother last week that she's in her early 90s, she's on her own. And she says, the people around, she's lived there where she lives for half a century. The people, it's in central London, the people around the square, they all know her. When she goes out, everyone greets her. People come and knock on the door and say, "Can I walk the dog?" Someone checks on her a couple of times a day, apart from her carer. And those are things that just didn't used to happen. And it's just a fairly typical thing. So I think the thing I like about these 5 values is that they resonate, and they're not only theologically very solid, and that's set out in the report, but they resonate with something deep within our society that people say, yeah, that sounds right. That sounds good to me. Even those of no faith at all, they like the sound of that because it goes deep within our culture.
Justine, it's been a real, genuine privilege to listen to all those questions relating to planning and the fantastic paper that's been produced by the Church of England this week. But I've got a final question, and obviously, as a final question with 5 lawyers, I can't fail to take this as an opportunity. When you get a guest, very often you undertake research and you go down rabbit holes. And the more I read in terms of things you said, the more I hope you're somewhat of a kindred spirit to some of us that'll be on the call. Back in 2013, you said, "Justice of the powerful is not justice at all, and judges should decide issues based on truth and the common good, rather than class and money." So my question, just a small issue at the very end of our conversation, is how important do you perceive the rule of law in general terms is, particularly to those who are at the bottom of society?
Well, actually, I'll answer it seriously. I mean, it's something I remember when I was reading law at Cambridge, HLA Hart, Law, Liberty and Morality. Still get it on my shelf just up here. I still look at it from time to time. The rule of law, there are about 80 million Anglicans around the world. The Church of England's about 2% of them. Your average Anglican is a woman in sub-Saharan Africa in her 30s on less than $4 a day with a 50-50 chance of being in a place of persecution or conflict. And so I've spent much of the last 20 years in mediation, conflict mediation in places like Nigeria, in South Sudan, Kenya, and war zones elsewhere in the Middle East, with people who are in countries where the rule of law is only the rule of the gun. I remember on one wonderful occasion in Palestine, I was stopped at a roadblock and a rather drunk guy, soldier, police officer with an AK-47 shoved the barrel into my face and was asking for all kinds of questions, and my mobile phone went off. This was a long time before I was Archbishop. And I sort of smiled politely, as one does in the circumstances, and picked it up, said, "Do you mind?" So I said, "Hello." And at the time, I was living in Warwickshire, and this voice said, Mr. Welby, it's Southern Windows. Would it be convenient for us to come and do your windows this afternoon? I said, well, could I ring you back? I'm just being held at gunpoint in a checkpoint in the Middle East. Oh, yes, that's quite convenient, sir. Now, but the point about that is in most of the countries where Anglicans live and where my wife and I go, and she goes and works with women leaders to renew in them their capacity for mediation, because you never make peace without the women being involved in these terrible situations. And when you go somewhere where you've, as I remember vividly doing with her, we went to a town where there were 3,000 unburied bodies, and a militia had swept through it. And I consecrated a mass grave into which the bodies of all the clergy, of townspeople were just piled, women, children. And that had been done by a senior member of the government of that country, by their militia. If the choice is, do we want the rule of law or that? I don't have to think for very long. The opposite of the rule of law is Hobbes. life which is nasty, brutish, and short. And at the risk of saying nice things about lawyers, what you do, even when it comes to planning, you look in towns all over the place and you look at some terrible thing where they've leveled a bunch of shops that were the only income source for some really poor people. They never had to ask for planning permission. They just had to get it done. And when you talk about parish councils, in my parish, I used to go to the town council. It's a small town. And the whole thing was, has councillor so-and-so noticed that the third street light down such and such a street is no longer working and one of the paving stones is sticking up? If you don't have that kind of system, you actually find you don't have anything at all. So to me, it is absolutely indispensable. But of course, I will finish by saying it's far too expensive.
Very difficult to argue with that. Justin, thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege. And of all the answers I expected to that question, that's probably the most powerful I could have even dreamed of. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We are so grateful to you. I can't say how much. You're absolutely right. Sometimes we do talk down the affordable housing in new developments, but I have to say, amongst all of us, sometimes we talk it up as well. And
I'm sure you do.
And we try to deliver more than is required sometimes. But we are so grateful to you, so grateful for this fabulous report. The moral authority of the church will be a voice to be listened to when so often this is not listened to. And it is a truly exceptional piece of work.